you could log in one day and everything's fine. The next day, your key card doesn't work. Why would they not have a job? I need to go to where the capabilities are, where the talent is.
What are some of the myths and realities when it comes to talent career preferences? And what does it mean for organizations who want to attract top talent? That's what we'll talk about in today's episode of Outsized Advantage, a podcast about flexible workforce model and agile talent. I'm Niclas Thelander, founder of Outsized, and I'm joined by Anurag Bhalla, my co-founder and head of Asia Pacific for Outsized.
Hello.
Hello. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Good. So, Anurag, when it comes to the myths and realities of kind of talent career preferences, would you mind starting by just setting the scene in terms of where we are today in the talent market?
Yeah.
Especially maybe focused on the skilled segment of the market.
Yeah, for sure. So just in terms of to frame, I guess, the conversation and some of the insights we're going to be discussing and sharing, let's talk about markets. So the first thing is to say is the focus of the discussion, the focus of the insights I'm going to be sharing are going to be on mainly APAC, Middle East and African markets. So we're not talking about, more developed markets or UK, US, European markets, which are very different and operate differently. The second thing is when we think about the independent skilled market or the gig economy, for a better term, we're going to be talking about a very specific talent segment within that, which is the professional segment. In terms of defining what we mean by that, if we think about what do we mean by professional segment, we are talking about people you would traditionally consider as career professionals, high skilled, high value skill segments. So this can be across skills. You're talking marketing, technology, digital, data, risk, compliance, operations. So essentially the fundamental anchors of any big business or the center of key projects that would be happening around most large enterprises. And that is really the segment that we focus on, and a lot of our insights will be based on.
So if we go into some of the specifics in terms of the kind of the myths and realities, looking at, I guess, who's controlling careers, what's kind of changed there in the last few years, would you say?
Yeah. So before we go into those specific components, I think it's worth going back to the market that we came into 7 years ago. So when we first came and sort of brought our value proposition and our thinking to the market, what we found was that when we spoke to large organizations, the mindsets were very much entrenched in acquiring, hiring and retaining permanent employees. An organization's success was really driven by how many thousands of people did they employ, and how many big buildings did they put them in. And when you spoke to them about this independent professional segment, most of their first answer was, well, who are these people, and why would they not have a job? And therefore, aren't they probably the people that are not very good? Or the second thing would be, but if they're independent, then how do I make them mine? How do I own them? How do I ensure that that talent is owned by me? Or the third component might be, but what about the risk that brings my organization? What about if these people come in and destroy my business? So there are all these constraints and worries, very much a risk-based view of the independent sector. And then when we spoke to the talent side, again, the thinking was very traditional in terms of, well, what about job security? If I leave my permanent job, if I'm an independent, where does my security come from? The second component might be, well, what about my pension and my benefits and my insurance and my protection? So there are all these initial constraints and pushbacks to this whole concept of a professional independent career, both in terms of organizations tapping into that type of talent, but also individuals looking at that as an actual alternative career path. So that's sort of market we came into. The other thing that's probably worth talking about is what did the independent skills sector look like in Asia and Africa when we first came to market. In general, what we found was that the players were sort of split between a few key operators. So you had your, what I call sort of the micro gig economy, right? Mainly dominated by large scale technology platforms that offer access to large volumes of diverse range of people who do, a few hours here, a few hours there. They're likely to have multiple jobs, or they have a day job and they do some evening weekend work. So that's what I call sort of the more micro gig, low value, low skilled, short durations.
Kind of side hustles.
Lots of side hustles, additional incomes, maybe pursuing a hobby on the side, earning a little bit of income. So you had these sort of micro gig platforms. The user of those traditionally could be anyone. So whether it's a medium organization, whether it's an individual, whether it's a large organization, but they're tapping into this sort of large base of micro gig workers. Then you had your sort of very, very senior advisory type talent segment. So these were people, retired professionals in the main, 30-year plus, high skilled for sure, but really in the advisory space. So willing to give, a few hours here, a few hours there, board seat, come and have a meeting, come and have a call, and deliver their knowledge and expertise.
The typical kind of expert network.
Exactly, and the expert network sort of play a great role in servicing that end of the market in terms of the expert network. And then you really had recruiters who would traditionally hire for permanent roles that may at times say, I can do a contract role for you. So you had this sort of contract market. Mainly a lot of that was in the tech space, body shopping. But again, a lot of that contract work is what I call sort of bums on seat type hiring. It was high volume, lower skilled, lower value jobs. And then the rest of the gig economy in these markets was sort of, again, for want of a better word, the sort of blue collar gig economy. Mainly people that didn't actually want to be gig workers. So these are your drivers, your riders, your delivery, people. And then you had, so that was a very big segment. So when people talk gig, 7 years ago, they very much straight away went to those types of segments in the market. And that was, I guess, our starting point to change that.
Cool. Okay, so that's a great framing of kind of the market that we went into. But kind of fast forwarding to what it looks like now, right? So, do you want to go into some of the myths and realities maybe that the myths that's been busted over the years that we've been operating?
Yeah. So I think the biggest one to probably start with is the concept or the belief that a permanent job delivers security, and I think that's the biggest thing that's actually changed the market. What you've seen over the last 7 years is people's have reflected and assessed their relationship with their work and their employer. And a lot of things have driven that. So the first thing, and it's unavoidable, is mass redundancies. Most people would have either been impacted directly or seen someone close to them be impacted directly by a job loss, and a lot of the times not due to anything in their control. And I think that jolted a lot of people. Seeing those mass redundancies, seeing that at any moment you could log in one day and everything's fine. The next day your key card doesn't work.
Okay. So the loss in terms of faith in your employer, kind of looking after you in the sense that you know that you have a career for life, whatever happens.
I think interestingly, there was this, and I sort of use a parallel to sports fans. So when I think about people in their relationship with their companies and their work, they build a very deep emotional connection, and you start to assume, hey, this is mutual. The company feels the same way about me. So if I'm willing to sacrifice if I'm willing to give everything, then I'm sure my company sees it and sees me as an individual and has the same sort of deep emotional connection, has my back. And I always see that parallel with sports fans in terms of people that are devout supporters of their sports teams will go to every single game, risk their financial, security around following their teams. Many times those teams have no concept of them as an individual, but you get this feeling of, hey, there's this emotional connection between us, right?
That like builds you that. And AFC Wimbledon.
Me and AFC Wimbledon, exactly. So I think these mass redundancies, and it's not saying these companies acted wrongly or did anything poor, but I think there was this mismatch of expectations. There was a relationship that existed where both sides weren't clear on the nature of that relationship. And I think a lot of people who are employees felt a deeper connection, and at times didn't realize, hey, if actually the company is in a particular situation where there's costs that need to be cut, or there's capability that they don't need anymore, if there's a change in strategy, if there's a market shift, and they have to make a change, they're going to make that change in a moment.
I mean, for us operating in some of the Asian markets in particular, where it's been relatively traditional, the employment models, right? If you look at some of the Southeast Asian markets, a lot of the times you went into company and you imagine being there for the next kind of 30 years.
Yeah.
You've with Outsized, you've been first in India and now obviously in Southeast Asia. Has the mindset shift been bigger in those kind of markets than, let's say, in other geographies where maybe that bond between employer and employee has been looser, was looser from an earlier stage?
Yeah, so I think what you've seen is this big shock to the system. And then, so you've got the mass redundancies that's come in, then you've had COVID. And I think COVID was another accelerant to this mindset shift where people had an opportunity to reflect on, well, how am I spending my time? How am I spending my 12, 14 hours a day? Is this where I want to spend my time? Is this where I want to deploy my energy? What is my relationship like? Am I growing in my career? Am I getting what I need out of it? And so I think people had an opportunity to really reflect. I think when you're in the race, when you're going in Monday to Friday and you're building, you sort of just, you're on a continuous travelator, right? I think COVID allowed people to stop, reflect, and maybe reassess actually their priorities and reassess the relationships. You had the redundancies coming in, you had COVID coming in. And I think the biggish impact of that security question was people had also applied a lot of brand equity to their company. So they were their company. So if you take an Asian market, and this is generalizing a little bit, but we're going to have to, when you go into a social interaction, and I was in Mumbai for 3 years and I had this every day. You go into a social interaction, what's the first thing someone asks you when you meet for the first time? It's, what do you do? And what the answer to that question is actually critical, because who you say you work for then has a direct impact to where that individual places you in terms of credibility, in terms of social status, in terms of actually, are you a worthwhile person to spend time with? Do I want to be associated with you? So when you say, hey, I work for big company X that you know about, immediately you get some sort of social credibility out of it. Hey, you're someone of value. You're someone of worth, right? If you say, hey, I work for an unknown name, then immediately they're like, do I want to spend time with you? Are you of value? So people's brand equity, their self-worth are very much connected to that company. There's also a cultural component to it, right? Where, hey, you want to go home and say, hey, I studied, I did my MBA, and now I work for this company that my parents, my you guys know and associate quality with. So again, you've got this family component of, hey, success is again linked to working for known company X and having a permanent job and having security. So all of this huge value and huge pressure was there. Now, when people realize that, hey, this security isn't necessarily there, in a moment, as I say, you can come in and, your key card doesn't work, you've been logged out, you get dialed into a video call and, someone reads off a script and then suddenly you don't have a job. You realize the security isn't in the contract. The security isn't driven by the contract or the company. I think people start to realize I need to take ownership of this security. Well, how do I create my own security? If I can't rely on the company giving security, and actually, why should they, right? They can't secure me for life, and it's not really their job to do so. How can I take ownership of that security? And I think that's when people started to say, well, the way I do that is I focus on accumulating skills and expertise and knowledge, right? So you saw this shift between the accumulation and focus of how do I accumulate longevity in a role, how do I accumulate job titles, how do I accumulate brands, to actually how do I accumulate knowledge and skills and experiences that make me highly value in a company. Most of the time, an organization will look at someone's skills and expertise and say, do I need this skills and expertise, right? They're not looking at the job title. So I think that allowed people to say, hey, I want to take back ownership. So when we used to speak to people 7 years ago and say, tell me about yourself, they would say, hey, my name's Anurag and I work for. It's the first thing they would say. I think now when you talk to people, their identity is a lot more connected to their skill. Hey, my name's Anurag and, I'm a expert in strategy, or I'm a product expert and I currently work with. And that addition of the skill in that conversation before employer, I think, is a really small but really important shift, because now I'm focused on, hey, how do I hone my skill? Therefore, how do I create value that someone will want? And therefore, how do I create security? And actually, in a very unpredictable, volatile world, people want to take control. So it's not a nice feeling to feel like a victim. So if I take control and create my own security, I also feel more confident about the way I operate.
Okay. So it's maybe the way things always were, in a sense, that you as an individual had to take control of your careers, but now that's kind of a more implicit situation where people actually realize that, and they, especially in kind of in our segments of the market. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the relationship was always like this.
Yeah. But
one side,
kind of element of it, I guess, that it was like that through these trends and things that happen. People realize that, and also can actively do something about that, right?
Exactly. And look, why is this happening? So why are these mass redundancies happening? Why are organizations shifting and changing? Why is there more volatility and uncertainty? I think if you then go to the client side, companies aren't just firing people and changing things for no reason, right? So I think what created that security blanket before was actually there's a lot of stability in the market, right? Big companies would look 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future, and they could sort of see and project how the world was going to look and how their growth was going to look like, what they needed to build, and therefore they could give that security to their people, and so people could have those careers for life. Now what I feel like, if we look at the environment we operate in, big companies are operating in very uncertain environments. So if you're in a C-suite, or if you're in a leadership position within a large organization today, look at how unpredictable the market is now. So if you look at competitive uncertainty, any moment now with technology advancement, digital advancement, you could get a competitor starting up and launching, building a customer base and disrupting your business in a moment. So you've got competitive uncertainty and technology driving that. Then you've got uncertainty in terms of political, social, right, uncertainty. There can suddenly be a war popping up, right, on your back door. So you've got all of that in terms that could impact your supply chains, or change how your business operates, or impact your customers or your products. Then you've got environmental. There's an environmental crisis. There's a health crisis. Again, completely disrupts your business. So there's all of these big changes happening. Recently we've seen that over the last 10 years. Big economic uncertainty. So suddenly these big organizations are operating on sand, right? They're not sure what's going to happen, and their proximity in terms of being able to forecast and see ahead of time is so much shorter. They need to look more short term, and so they're also looking at saying, how do I build agility in my organization? How do I ensure that I can adapt and flex based on these changing environments? And so that, I think, volatility is then feeding through to the talent, their people, who then get disrupted off the back of that.
So, how has the kind of perception of independent work and freelancing changed over the last few years?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift is around the difference between necessity and choice. So I think if you take our markets, a lot of the gig economy was dominated by necessity. So people that actually couldn't get permanent jobs or couldn't get that security, and therefore had to be part of this gig economy.
Or they started a new business.
Or they started a new business. And I think the biggest change is now people are choosing. And that the people that have that privilege of choice are that high-skilled segment. So if you take the UK, US, European markets where we've operated, being an independent is highly aspirational. Because by being an independent, what you're saying is, hey, I have built so much expertise to a level that someone is willing to buy into my brand equity, my expertise. They're actually willing to hire me based on who I am, not the brand equity or the credibility of the company I work for. They're not leveraging that, they're leveraging my skill. So having that confidence in your skill, having built up that level of expertise, is highly aspirational because it allows you to drive the conversation. It brings power into you as an individual. You can choose who you work with, when you work, the type of work that you do. You're in charge of your own destiny, right? You've taken back control. And so I think that's hugely powerful. So if I look back at my time in London, most of the best people were independents. And they'd come into the organisation, they'd have huge impact, and they'd leave. That didn't really exist, and I think what's changed is now that is the fastest growing segment of the gig economy that we see in our markets. That traditional career professional that would have jumped from company to company, 3 years here, 5 years there, 10 years there, is now saying actually there's a new way of doing things that they hadn't realised before. There is a new way of building my career. And succeeding as an individual. I think some of those social constraints that I talked about in terms of people position you based on who you work with have started to change. Now, if you start to say now, hey, I run my own business, I think that holds huge credibility, right, in the market. Hey, I'm an independent. Hey, that must mean that you're good. So I think some of the markets change. I think demand has helped this. So I think the increase of organizations looking to tap into this independent talent pool, we'll talk about why. The growth of demand and opportunity, people's changing mindsets, the shifts in the relationship between individual and employer, COVID reflection has meant that a lot of people are saying, hey, I'm going to change my relationship with work. There is a different way to build my career and earn an income. And I think a few things are happening. Portfolio-based earnings, I think, are becoming increasingly popular. People saying, hey, if you talk to any wealth manager, they'll all talk about, hey, diversified portfolio, right? If you look at most of us who work for one company, our income is 100% with one channel, right? And if that gets turned off, my security is significantly low, right? I'm in a bad place, especially as most of us are living outside of our means nowadays. So then you can quickly get in quite difficult problems. So a portfolio-based approach, I think, is increasing where individuals are saying, hey, I'm going to have my, a work here that I'm getting income from. I might do something in business over here and get some income here. I might do some, board advisory type work here. And creating sort of different income streams. Maybe they'll buy some property. Maybe they'll, set up an e-commerce business. Maybe they'll turn their hobby into some sort of income. So I think people are looking at more portfolio-based career building. And then 2, people are saying, well, if the security isn't there, the demand is there, why don't I start to change my relationship work and go into becoming an independent? And that's why I think we've seen this significant increase on the talent side in terms of people wanting to enter the market because of the upsides. If you take away the upsides of a permanent job, which is the security and the certainty, you say that doesn't exist anymore, actually the career of an independent, a lot of those constraints have gone and the attractiveness increases. So just to add to that, I think when people used to use terms like gig or freelancing, immediately what came to mind in people's views was, hey, that means one of a few things. If you take freelancing, a lot of people would assume, hey, that's in the creative segment only. So freelancers are designers, right? They design logos and websites, or they're marketeers, right? So either creatives in the freelance space, or hey, it's in sort of low-skilled segments, right? If you take gig, or in technology. So I think mainly when you used to talk to people about, hey, freelancing, they say, well, that's for creatives, or that's for technology people, that's for sort of low-skilled, low values, right? And I think what's, again, a big shift is that professional segment. People who have deep expertise in their chosen skill, have built up careers, over say 5-10 years, and now moving out of the permanent market into the independent sector. And I think that's the biggest shift in our markets. That just wasn't there before. That taking that leap of faith to say, actually, I can go a different route, enabled by opportunities, has been the biggest shift.
So from an access to talent perspective, through COVID, I guess, and maybe other trends as well, we've seen a big shift in terms of, where do companies sit and where do talent sit, right? Mm. Can you talk us through a bit kind of what you've seen in the market on in terms of the movement of talent?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting things happening, and so the first one would be to say, hey, before you live where you work, right? So often people would first decide, work out where they worked, and then it's okay, now I'll decide where I live, right? In connection with that. That changed. So a few things are going on. During COVID, what happened, a lot of people left and moved out of, say, cities, or moved away because they didn't have to come to the office every day, and so changed their their living location. So there was that initial shift. Now, some of that has gone back. So some people have come back, and some organizations are saying, hey, you need to be back in the office, and there is that. So not all of these trends are forever. But there was a shift in mindset at that point that said, hey, there is a different way of doing this. I don't need to live where I work. And that was coming from the talent side. But even if we take it from an organization side, hey, before, organizations, I think, would constrain themselves, say, I need to shop in my local shop, right? If I'm looking at talent, I need to only focus on the talent that exists within my world, right? And I think a few things are changing there. One, organizations through COVID have realized, hey, actually, it can work to access talent and work with people that might not be on site all the time. So I think it opened their eyes in terms of, hey, there is other talent out there. I can shop in a bigger market. There's new talent I can bring in. There's high capability. So it increases choice, increases opportunity for clients. So I think that helped them get over the line in terms of saying, hey, I don't need to just focus on people in close proximity to me. So that opened up local and regional markets. I think the other thing that happened was that if you look at the UK, US, European markets, where a lot of talent would go from, say, Asia, right, a lot of that talent is staying or coming back. So as those markets start to make it harder for foreign talent to stay or to move or to gain visas, some of the social political changes happening, a lot of talent is coming back to their home nation. So you're getting a lot of good talent coming back into the market, a lot of good talent staying as opposed to leaving. And then you've got this opening of borders in terms of organizations not being constrained by their borders. Added to that, in Asia, we're seeing really interesting innovation on the visa infrastructure starting to happen. You've seen a lot of countries announcing freelancer visas, digital nomad visas, creating the infrastructure that allows people to offer their services more easily across borders. So I think some of that infrastructure coming in, organizations opening up their outlook, people both looking to maybe work in not live where they work, but also we're seeing a trend towards people being willing to move for work. And I think the reason for that is that there has been a shift in terms of people's focus on fixed lives. I think with globalization and movement, people are a lot more willing to move for work where the opportunities are. Even influences such as less and less people owning homes, right? So if you look at the market like that, less and less people are able to own homes. That creates less of a restriction in terms of being able to move for opportunities, and a lot more openness to follow where the interesting work may be. So I think all of this creates, I think, a really great benefit in terms of accessing talent.
But so when we first started, I think it's fair to say that 95% probably of the cases, talent and clients were in the same location, right? At least, I would say. It differed a little bit in some of our regions. But has that changed a lot now, do you think? And if so, how do companies make the decision whether or not to as you say, shop in your local shop, or to look kind of broader? So what are the kind of criteria that or decision process that they go through?
So yes, it has changed, but not to the extent that maybe people sometimes assume, that now it's all remote, and organizations are willing to mobilize teams and capabilities across any location anywhere. So what we're finding is that it's still very regionally focused. So let's take Southeast Asia. When they think about shopping in a broader market, they're not saying, hey, I'm just going to bring in talent from anywhere. They're saying, hey, I can maybe open up to, if I'm based in Malaysia, maybe I'll look at Indonesia, or maybe I'll look at Philippines. So I think opening up within the region, I think is the first thing. So you're seeing sort of cross-border across regions. You're also seeing an emergence, I think, more of hybrid models where there's a 2 to 3 day, let's say a week, on site, FaceTime, and then split time remote. So you're seeing a big increase in sort of hybrid models, but on site is still there. But I think there's more of a willingness to actually bring people in, but also people to relocate for periods of time. So I think for the on-site work, they're still able to shop in a broader market because there's more willingness for them and more infrastructure available for them to actually move people in. And people are more willing actually to work cross-border and follow the opportunities. But it hasn't moved all to remote. So we're still finding, for execution especially, so in terms of the reasons why, when you're getting to deep execution, so you've done your thinking, you've done your strategy, and you're trying to build and execute key initiatives within your organization, still we find FaceTime is key. So having that team on site together delivering is there. Hybrid for sure also in that model, but fully remote execution is a rare scenario.
And would companies typically start out local and then say, hey, we don't think there's not enough skills in our local market, hence we go broader, or do they kind of start broad and see, hey, we want to find the best, agile coach in the region? They do that from day one, or how does it typically work?
That's great. So what we're seeing is now organizations wanting to see what else is out there, and if they can access better capability or high quality talent, then they will be open to bringing that in. So I'd say priority one is still, if I can find what I need and I can find the best quality locally, that's great. That's number one. Okay. But if I can't, I'm more than willing to go into another market.
There's been a lot of change. We've seen that, and it's been driven both from the talent side as well as from the client side. But what does this actually mean for an employer who wants to attract and hire top talent? These trends that we've been seeing.
Yeah. So I think the first challenge organizations face is how to find these people, because their traditional routes of assessing talent will actually at times remove some of these people from their gaze. Because if you look at how you might judge an individual historically, it might be, well, why did they move from this job after a year and then do this for 6 months and then do that for 2 months? And so people were looking for, well, if they've moved around, that can't, that's not a good sign, right? So I wouldn't even assess that person. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge that this segment exists, and then think about actually how do you identify them and find them, and how do you change your mindset in terms of assessing talent? Because independents naturally will have a very different profile in terms of when you're looking for them. So I think being able to identify these people and not judge them with a permanent hiring mindset, I think is a big shift actually that HR teams are struggling with as of today. So acknowledging who they are, acknowledging they exist, and finding ways to access them, find them, and assess them is super important. I think going where the talent is going to be important. So before, I think an organization had the confidence to say, well, talent will come to me. I think now the change is, hey, I need to go to where the capabilities are, where the talent is. I need to be willing to be flexible in terms of how I engage that talent and where I engage that talent. So I think go to wherever that high quality talent is, which means look at the whole market, look at what you have available to you. And then the third component is being flexible in terms of how you engage those individuals. So previously there was this mindset that there's a permanent market and there's an independent market. There's the people that only want permanent jobs, and there's the people that only want contractual work. And for sure there are percentages of those people. So there are people that would never ever consider an independent contract. And there's people that would never ever consider taking a permanent job because they so believe, passionately about their independent careers, and they don't want to be owned by anyone. But there is a big proportion of people out there that will follow the work, that will assess the opportunity, and think about the contract next. So is this an interesting piece of work? Is this an interesting organization? Are these people I want to work with? Is this a place I want to spend time? If the answers to those things are yes, hey, okay, well, I'm willing to consider a perm. I'm willing to consider a contract. Maybe for a few years I'll be an independent and do contract work. Maybe then a really interesting permanent opportunity will go, and I'll do that for a few years, and then maybe an interesting independent. So I think this blurring of the market now, that actually talent can move from one to the other and not be defined by the nature of their contract, I think is also important. So organizations being willing to engage people in different ways based on their preference, I think is going to be important as well.
Okay. And finally, maybe do companies need to change in order to be attractive to this segment? I mean, we're talking primarily about the kind of the skilled segment of the market, right? The people who do have a choice in terms of where they want to go next and what kind of projects they want to do. Yeah.
So I think acknowledgement that there is a different beast, right? They're a different beast. They're a different animal. So the persona of a person coming into organization as independent is different to the person that's joined your organization as a permanent employee. So you can't create a single employee value proposition for both segments. Like in any business, if you're trying to build a business, if you're trying to sell a product, trying to sell a service, you'll first understand your customer, right? You'll then understand what are the segments within my customer base, and then you'll come up with an approach that is segmented, right? So each different segment within your customer base will get a slightly different service or value proposition. The same goes for companies. They need to acknowledge that there are different segments that now exist within an organization. And an independent professional might want different things, might have different challenges, might need different things from you, might value different things, might want to be treated differently to a permanent employee. Some of those things might be the same, some of those things might be fundamentally different. And I think acknowledging that the answer isn't just to treat them as an employee, and the answer isn't just to treat them as a foreign contractor. The answer is to first understand the needs of this segment, and then to build a value proposition that will attract them, that acknowledges them as a different type of persona of employee.
And that's probably where a lot of companies have some work to do in terms of actually realizing that fact, right? Because my impression at least is that, hey, when it comes to permanent employees, they've got it sorted. I'm talking about employee value proposition for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
But with freelancers or independent professionals, it's a lot of companies haven't even started that work in terms of defining what that proposition should be.
Agree. I think it very, very immature in the thinking. And the reason for that is because the the volume of that segment within their employee base has traditionally been so small. Yeah. And now what we're seeing is HR leaders and people leaders within organizations are saying, wow, over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that population within my employee base of independents is growing significantly. I'm going from 1% to 2% to 3% to 5% to 7% to 10%, and just growing. And therefore, and the demand for independent talent within my business teams is growing. And therefore, that population is going to increase. So I both want to attract these individuals, but also they're in my organization, so I have a responsibility for them. So I think, have organizations gone through the tipping point of seeing the value in independence? Absolutely. Are they trying to scale those models? Absolutely. Have they realized what that means for them in terms of the value proposition? No. I think at the moment what they're doing is one of two things. They're going on the extreme. So organizations either go, we're just going to treat you just like our employees, and we're going to give you, we're going to try and do that, which often doesn't work. Or, hey, you're a complete foreign entity, and therefore, you're going to be treated completely differently, and we're going to create a bubble around you as an individual, and you're not allowed to interface in a way, with the rest of the ships. So I think they're going one of two ways, and I think HR leaders are now saying, well, I acknowledge that I have this changing workforce. How do I create? What are these people? How do I understand them? And I think that's where they're at.
Okay, cool. I think that's a topic that we'll definitely go into in more detail another time. But that's been very interesting for me. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.